know many of you, and many of you I haven't met before. And, under the conditions we've been living and operating under for the last year or so, I just haven't had as much face-to-face interaction. But I'm glad that you're with us today. And hopefully I won't cover too many things that you already know about. And we'll have plenty of time for questions. And so anyway, I would be interested in knowing at some point how many, I'm going to unshare this for a second. And just tell me if you have fruit trees already by going down to the reactions box and just, you can give us a thumbs up like I just did. Very good. Well, and some of you, I recognize you. That's great. Okay, so you can take that thumbs up. Well, yeah, we can. I think you have to wait for it to time out. Let me ask you this. How many of you have old fruit trees, like 20 years or more? Okay, not as many, but still quite a few. That's good. Okay, well, the things we're going to cover today, I just wanted to really get some background from you and get to know the audience a little bit. I'm going to share the screen again, and we'll get rolling here. So backyard fruit trees, it's not a simple little thing where, you plant it and walk away. There's a lot of maintenance, fertilization, irrigation, thinning, so many things that are important to do to manage these trees and keep them productive for their whole lifespan. But also fruit trees tend to alternate bear. So if you don't do these things, that means they'll have a big crop one year and a littler crop the next, or no crop. And if you do some of the things I'm going to discuss here, such as fertilization, certainly irrigation and pruning, those things will really help you have production every year. So launching into the presentation, this is what we would all imagine and love to have. I use this picture a lot. It's off of an old postcard from, I think, Central California. And that's really not the reality, though. It's great when we get nice big fruit and big crops, but almost always there's a challenge involved. And every year kind of brings a different one. But as I said, if we continue to, take good care of our trees and not even be afraid, if you have fruit trees that are not looking good or not producing, don't be shy about ripping those out and putting in a new one, because disease trees and insect-prone trees and trees that just don't produce anything, you can replace those and get a good tree that's going to be productive. And for the price of a tree, you may think, $25 or $30 is expensive, but over the years that it's productive, that's nothing compared to the amount of time and energy you're going to put into it. So moving forward, it does require this long-term commitment, as I've been describing. And the annual cultural practices that you'll want to think about doing and hopefully get to each year are listed here. And as I mentioned, pruning, fertilization, and irrigation are probably the main ones. But if you have weed competition, that can be an issue too. And then IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management. And today's talk, we aren't going to cover too much of that pest management material. In fact, none of it. We just don't have the time. But the thinning we'll cover, and then harvesting, I took out of today's presentation, but most places in Yavapai County that I'm familiar with, the birds that are in your neighborhood will tell you when it's time to harvest. And when they start pecking your fruit, get out there and taste it and see if it's ready to go. And some fruits, so we're talking deciduous fruits today, and that probably hasn't been mentioned yet, but these deciduous fruits are what we grow mostly in the mid to higher elevations of Yavapai County. So I won't be talking about citrus at all, but we'll cover apples and pears, and then those are called the pome fruits, Pome. And then we'll also talk about the stone fruits, which are the peaches and nectarines and apricots and plums and cherries and pluots and other things. And we won't talk too much about pomegranates today either, although pomegranates are a winner in most places in Yavapai County. At least we're around 4,000 feet, you can probably be successful with pomegranates. 5,000 feet, it might be a little dicey. So let's talk a little bit about site selection. And when you're looking for a good site for your orchard, you want to find the best soils, and deep, well-drained, productive soils. You may not know what's productive, but if you're in a clay soil area, you'll have deep soils, but they are not going to be extremely well drained. You're not going to be able to change that, but that's going to influence how you irrigate. You're going to have to apply irrigation water more slowly. But these fruit trees, the well-drained soils allow for oxygen to get to the roots to keep a healthy root system. And some of you are wondering, well, what is deep? Well, 2 feet and 3 feet deep soils are desirable for fruit trees. If you only have a foot of soil, you may consider importing some soil or mounding some soil to get some more depth there, because what we really want to do is establish a fruit tree that has a broad root system that can utilize precipitation when it occurs, and also explore as much soil as possible and be well anchored too. So when we're looking at sites, we're also interested in cold air drainage. And when you select a site, you're going to want it somewhere where the cold air isn't going to pool. The little graphic that's at the bottom of this slide here shows how cold air flows down in a two-dimensional representation. But these trees here aren't dense enough to slow that cold air as it drains, so it keeps moving. But if you had a large hedge, or if you had a block wall or a solid wood fence even, that's going to cause the air, the cold air, to pool behind it, and this will be a colder area behind that hedge. So cold air drainage is desirable, and it flows down. So, you know, a lot of times we don't have lots of choice where we put in fruit trees, but I also believe that it's best not to put a fruit tree in a lawn. You can do it, but boy, if you use a weed eater, I highly recommend that you do some weed control and keep that weed eater far away from the trunk of a fruit tree. A little bit of damage will last a long time. Gentle slopes are preferred because that'll keep the cool air draining. Of course, if you're in a lower elevation area like Dewey or Humboldt, or lower than that, or the Verde Valley, there's still some cold places over there. Along the Verde River can get very cold just because it's low lying. But the gentle slopes will allow the air to continue to move. And then there are some frost protection techniques. And when we talk about frost protection of these deciduous fruit trees, we're talking about protecting the tree from losing the bloom or the fruit embryos as they're forming. And so the most risky time that occurs during the season for deciduous fruit is in the spring. The trees come out of dormancy and they bloom, and then we can get a frost that hits. And if we get down around 28 degrees, that's usually the time when damage can occur. So I'm getting a little bit ahead here, but some of the things that you can do to minimize frost damage in the spring, certainly by picking the proper variety of your fruit tree, and we'll talk about how to do that a little later in the presentation, but if you have the proper variety, it'll hopefully bloom later. And the later it blooms, the higher probability that you'll miss those killing frosts in the spring. As I mentioned, 28 degrees Fahrenheit is when significant damage can occur to the small fruit that's forming. And not many home orchards can maintain bare ground, but the picture that's on the bottom right here shows a commercial peach orchard. It's a fairly older picture, but you notice that the bare ground is there. The idea being that when the sun hits that soil in the daytime, it warms it up. And that soil will absorb that heat and re-radiate it when it cools off in the evening. And that will mitigate some of the potential damage that could happen due to frost and cold temperatures in the spring. You can cover a tree too, but the tree has to be small enough, and the covering often damages the tree a little bit. You notice this fellow that's in the upper photo here, he's covering the tree. And if it's an early blooming tree and you're worried that it's going to dip into the mid-20s, you could put an incandescent light bulb, not an LED, but something that generates a little bit of heat in there after this covers all the way down. And that would probably prevent that tree from freezing that night. It doesn't become very practical when you're looking at trees in the size class of the bottom here. And so, if you've never gotten a fruit crop off of a certain tree and you've had it there for a long time, chances are it's a poor variety or it's not getting pollinated. And those are both issues that can happen. So let's talk a little bit about fruit trees and how to select them, because I'm telling you that if your old fruit trees aren't productive, you might consider removing them. But before you go out and remove it, you might think also about, is this a historic tree? And do I want to keep it just for sentimental reasons? And if it is, usually if it's, like 50 to 60 to even 80 or 100 years old, and there's many of these on the forest lands where old homesteads existed, you may just tell yourself, I'm going to just manage this tree for a historic tree, and I'm going to try and keep it alive. I'm not going to tell you to prune that tree and do a lot of real productive work on it. In other words, don't go in there and try and prune it to, look like a young fruit tree. Just take out the dead and diseased wood, keep it irrigated, and maybe give it a little fertilizer. But you're not going to turn a monstrous tree into a small, more productive tree at that stage in time. So some of the things that might be of interest to folks here is, okay, so, how do we grow fruit trees? Well, when you're buying a commercial fruit tree from a nursery, the rootstock is very important. And the rootstock is the portion that the scion is grafted onto. So the rootstock is in this picture over here. This whole plant that we're seeing here is the rootstock. That little twig there, that has been planted the season before. It has roots. And what the person in the photo is doing is they are budding that tree, or in other words, grafting it. And so we'll talk about that in a moment, but this rootstock could very well have disease-resistant qualities in it. So in other words, if there's a soil-borne disease, it may be more resistant to it, but almost always the fruit trees that are worth acquiring have some sort of dwarfing quality to their rootstock. And this photo across the bottom shows apples grafted onto different rootstocks and what the dwarfing capabilities of those rootstocks are. And in short, what's going on there is that rootstock is kind of being a gatekeeper as to how much resource goes to that scion, which is that bud, and that's the desired variety that you're growing, which would be, Granny Smith or Fuji or, any other name variety of any of these stone fruits or pome fruits that we've discussed. And so you can see that, there's a whole range of rootstocks. And don't ask me which of these is the best. The nurseries can tell pretty much which are the best. Whoops. And so just trust the nurseries to sell you a good tree. And I'm going to tell you also that I highly, highly prefer bare root trees, and we'll talk about that soon, as compared to container grown trees. So dwarfing does not mean you're going to have a small tree. This apple on the end here is 80% of what a standard non-dwarfing rootstock would do. But I'll tell you right now that almost every dwarfing, semi-dwarf rootstock, and that's the term that's used, semi-dwarf, when you get into these dwarfing rootstocks, those semi-dwarf trees are going to get huge unless you do some pruning on them and try and manage their size. The other consideration is graft compatibility. Again, the nurseries know about this, but sometimes, if you're just playing around at home and grafting, different things onto different plants, which a lot of people do, different apple varieties, say on an apple tree, the graft compatibility becomes really critical because some varieties of scion do not agree with their rootstock or don't agree. Some people graft one scion onto the original scion of a fruit tree. And so they'll graft another variety, perhaps of Fuji, onto a yellow delicious or something, golden delicious or something like that. And the grafts, the research is done by the nurseries. They know what's compatible, but often we don't. But that, I'm not trying to discourage you from experimenting. Precocity refers to how soon after you plant the tree, it will start producing fruit. And a more precocious tree, you might plant your bare root tree this year, and 3 years from now, it's very likely that you'll get a crop on it. But if you didn't have one of these grafted trees and you were just kind of shooting from the hip, so to speak, you might not get fruit for a long time. Other questions that sometimes come up, well, can I just grow a seed? You can grow a seed, but you won't know what you're getting, and it'll be a long wait to figure out whether the fruit is desirable. And that wait might be 7 to 10 years on some varieties. So anyway, but for the price of a young fruit tree, you can have the grower do all of this background work for you too. And as mentioned, this word scion, it's not only a type of car now, but scion is the desired variety. So this photo here shows a tea budding process. A little tea cut is cut in there when the bark is slipping. So you can see the bark is easily separating there. A bud has been now slipped in there. And what you do is you match that cambium layer on the bud to the cambium layer on the rootstock. And those will knit together. This bud will start to grow. And the next season, this rootstock is hacked off, pruned off, and the scion part is left. And now you have a dwarf fruit tree, semi-dwarf. The question will probably come up about true dwarfs. True dwarfs, there's not a lot of them, but there's more of them coming along, and they grow more like a shrub, and they generally aren't grafted onto rootstock. They are rooted from the dwarf variety. So the variety that comes to mind all the time with me is the Bonanza Peach, and it's a little 3 to 4 foot when mature, peach tree that looks like a shrub. So moving along, these are what bare root trees look like. I already mentioned that I recommend them. Containerized trees almost always come from one of these trees where a nursery has purchased these and then crammed them into a small container. And you can see that these root systems are pretty substantial here. So the other thing I want to point out, you can't see it well, but the graft union or where the bud was attached on is here. And you can see the little bend there. The rootstock would have grown over on this side, but now the bud's coming off the side there, and that's what produced this growth. And so all of this is from the scion. And each one of them has that. This one you can actually, if you look closely, see where the bud, where the rootstock was cut off and that wound hasn't healed yet. And that little kink right there shows the one on that. When you plant a fruit tree, you always want that graft union to be above ground. And on these trees, you can maybe detect it's a little darker. The original soil line is always visible on these, so that's where the soil line after planting should be. But when you receive these trees, they should be completely dormant, like the trees in the picture. That means no leaves, no flowers. And usually they're shipped in large boxes, and they have moist shavings on the root systems to preserve them. And then those are probably wrapped in plastic, loosely in plastic, but so there's some oxygen exchange, but still to prevent, the plastic will prevent moisture loss. So the other thing that's probably coming to your mind is, well, what about those little bag trees you see at the big box stores? Those are bare root. I don't recommend those. And quite often they're not very, they've been in those bags for a long time, and they aren't usually as desirable as these vigorous trees that we see in this photo here. And you often get what you pay for. So when you're selecting a variety, it's always good to know what USDA plant hardiness zone you're in. And I've included some of those for the local Prescott area here. But you can go online, and I'm pretty sure that in the chat box, we'll see a link to where you can find these USDA plant hardiness zones. And so all you have to do is get to these sites and enter a zip code, and it will tell you what zone you're in. And that's a starting point, because around a home, there are places that are warmer, there are places that are cooler. And so re-radiated heat from a concrete block wall or a home, some sort of thermal mass is going to make that area warmer. But you may have cooler places, perhaps where the cool air is pooling due to an obstruction in the flow of air. The other thing when you're selecting varieties is look for self-fruitful varieties. Or if you're considering non-self-fruitful varieties, do your homework to figure out what it cross-pollinates with. And the main place that I'm really aware that you need to pay attention to that is with sweet cherries. Almost always you need to have 2 cherry trees of Bing cherry or Montmorency or any of those sweet cherry varieties. You need 2 of them to cross-pollinate to really get a decent crop. Sour cherries or pie cherries generally are self-fruitful. And I'm going to share with you some resources where you can learn what is self-fruitful and what is not. You want to also consider selecting varieties that bear at different times. In my small orchard, I've planted many trees over time, but 2 of my real productive apple trees are a Fuji and a Granny Smith. The Fuji comes in usually in September, early October, but then the Granny Smith starts coming in October, usually late October. And so I have a little wiggle room there where I can preserve those apples and not have everything coming off the tree at one time. But the most important thing about your tree is the chilling requirement. And I think I have another slide for this, yes, that talks about the chilling requirements. And so the chilling requirement in general is the number of hours during the winter that it's between about 42, 45 and freezing. But it's a very inexact science. And one of the links that I've also provided as part of this talk, and so the talk will be posted to a website after we're done, and these resources will be shared there. But the Dave Wilson Nursery has really gone through and looked at a lot of the fruit varieties. And so I'm not supposed to endorse any nurseries. So I'm really not endorsing Dave Wilson Nursery. I do think they grow a quality fruit tree and so on, but I would encourage you to look at other nurseries. But what they've really gone out of their way to do also is provide educational materials on their website. So there's a great discussion about chilling requirements. It's a very inexact science, as I think I mentioned. And so these guidelines of what varieties to pick, it's good to talk to your neighbors and find out what else is going on. But for the Verde Valley, you can get away with 600 to 750 chill hours on things like peaches. Apples almost always are fruitful in the Verde Valley in this range and even a little bit below. Apples are generally more forgiving than some of the stone fruits. And then the Prescott area, if you're growing peaches, I would highly recommend going for a 900 or a 1000 chill hour variety. And I've had a couple of those. One of the peach varieties is called Ranger. I had one until the peach tree borers got it. And anyway, but with apple trees, again, we have a lot more flexibility. You could probably do okay with a 600 chill hour in the Prescott area on an apple or a pear. So as mentioned here, those are approximate numbers, and it's a starting place, but it's one of the best starting places. So that website that's on this slide is provided also in the resource materials, and it's probably in the chat box right now because I've got a small army of assistants helping me through this presentation. So this is from a Dave Wilson site. First thing I'll point out is this is one of their workers, and they're planting a bare root peach tree. I'm pretty sure it's a peach because it's flowering, and I'm pretty sure they wouldn't recommend that you plant one that's flowering, just as I said earlier. But you notice they dug a hole, and they are not, I repeat, they are not amending that soil. So that soil, the tree's going to have to learn how to live with the soil that you've got. So you do that right from the planting day on. So in general, I'll just streamline this. You would form a cone of soil down here such that the final grade is right where the desired soil line will be. And on this one, you can see the graft union there. And then the cone of soil would be here. And then you would work the air pockets out of that. I see him standing on it. I wouldn't recommend stomping on it too hard. You don't want to compact it when it's wet. But ultimately, that soil line needs to be in the right place. And that's how it's done. If any roots were dead or diseased or anything like that, you'd probably want to cut those off too, but hopefully you aren't going to see that. The other thing I want you to notice is that he's pruned this tree right after he planted it to an open center, and we're going to talk more about that. When I've done pruning workshops, we've been doing them about for the last 22 years, but this year we didn't hold any because of the COVID situation that we're working with. But this is what I highly recommend you do to almost any fruit tree. The one exception might be a pear, because some pears just grow vertically straight up and you'll never turn them into an open center tree. And if you're mystified as to what an open center tree is, we'll get to that right now. There are two general trains of thought on pruning fruit trees, and most commercial growers want to go with this modified central leader, or larger scale growers. So this central leader, yeah, it's been pruned back here, but in general, it's got a main leader going through it. And apples and pears traditionally have been pruned to this. What I'm going to suggest is that you prune your apple trees differently. And if you've got a pear tree that's well behaved, you could even prune it to an open center. But for backyard trees, if you're in the age class that I'm in, I don't want to get on a ladder if I don't have to. And my orchard's on uneven ground. I don't need to take a fall. So if I can do most of my work from the ground, I love that. And so I'll show you a picture of one of my trees in a little bit. But this is an open center tree on the bottom right. And all the stone fruits you want to prune this way and train this way. But I would highly encourage backyard orchards to go this route for apples as well. And if I had this tree, if I moved into a house that had this tree and it was about 3 or 4 inches right here, I'd turn this tree into an open center myself too. Because I like to get the growth going horizontally. The benefit of doing it this way is you can have your trees closer, they can get bigger, and they'll be more productive, but you'll be pruning, you'll be on a ladder to prune, and you'll also be on a ladder to thin and harvest your fruit. So those are the trade-offs. Open centers are great for backyard trees though. So these diagrams here, I won't spend a lot of time on these, but this is a progression from the young tree to various ages. It's probably 1 year each drawing here of the same tree. And what it's showing is which branches you might remove. And what I'd remind everybody of is this is a drawing, this is a cartoon. It's never perfect in nature. So you're always trading off. The best thing for the tree might not be the best thing for your goals. And the other thing about pruning is it's nice if you can get somebody to teach you and show you a few things, but also after you prune, just observe what happens and you will learn so much just from how the tree reacts. And in my perception also, this is an apple tree because as it gets bigger, these little short stems that are forming here on the third and the fourth, the fourth and the fifth version of this, those are the spurs. And that's spur as in like cowboy spur, S-P-U-R. And that's where on apple and pear trees and on plums and apricots too, where the fruit is produced, where the flower will appear and where the fruit is. So compare that. That was the modified central leader previously. I'll go back to it for a second. We have a leader going all the way up still on these to an open center tree. So just like in that picture there, the first year, they just prune it off real small here. And then these branches that are left behind to become the tree, those are called scaffold branches on both types of trees. But the scaffold branches become the important productive wood of your tree over time. And in these pictures also, these little vertical straight things, those are just spreaders that have been put in there. I don't really recommend using those, but some people do. Usually they get knocked out by, by you or the wind or something like that. But this is a way that people use to train trees if the branch angle isn't desirable here. In other words, if they were paralleling each other in inches apart, the spreader is holding them apart. But what I'll say at this point is by this time, the tree is getting mature. And when fruit is being formed on some of these branches, it actually causes them to droop down. And so these spreaders may not even be necessary. So anyway, and what I would also probably try and do is just manage the height of this tree and try and shoot for getting it to spread more horizontally in a backyard situation. So this is my one of my star producers. This was taken about 3 years ago. This tree is 20 years old now, but it's a Fuji Apple that's pruned to an open center. It's not the most attractive thing in the world, but I can handle all of the pruning and harvesting from the ground. And at 17 years old and even 20 years old, I'm pretty proud of that. If you, well, I don't think we'll have time today, but I have a little tour of the trees if we have time. But this link down here, if you come back to this presentation, it takes you to the YouTube that shows this tree and a couple of other trees in my yard. So let's talk about irrigation for a minute. I'm checking the time. We're on the home stretch here. I think flood irrigation is most desirable. So having a basin that's about where the drip line of the tree is, so that would be the vertical projection of the outer branches. That's ideal. And as the tree gets really huge, you don't need to be all the way out there, but the broader that you can irrigate the tree and that your basin can be, generally the happier the tree is going to be. Drip irrigation can be effective, but you just have to make sure that you add to your drip irrigation as the tree grows too. 2 emitters at the base of any long-term woody plant is not going to cut it. And that's the rest of that discussion's for another day. But if you use drip irrigation, make sure that you're irrigating it in a pattern that is even throughout the whole drip line, if possible. Micro sprinklers will do it too. These are the small sprinklers that have a spray pattern that maybe goes a foot or 2 feet. Again, they're kind of an extension of a drip type system, but they have different spray heads on them. A bubbler would be very good too. A bubbler just gently puts the water out and fills the basin. But also remember that if we're having a dry winter, like we had last year, not this winter, but the winter before, it's a good idea to put out some water about every month if possible. The trees will tolerate not having it, but it's just, I think the tree will appreciate it and maintain its vigor better if it's not super droughty in the soil. And then mulching will prevent evaporation and will conserve soil moisture. So I'm talking about mulching it with something like wood chips or bark or something along those lines. I wouldn't recommend a rock mulch under a fruit tree so much. And what that'll do is it'll keep the soil cool and it'll prevent evaporation from the soil surface. But if you're also relying on your soil to re-radiate heat to prevent a spring frost, it's a double-edged sword there, where mulching might defeat the purpose of having bare soil. I know it sounds contradictory. The other thing to remember with fruit trees is they need fertilizer. And the fertilizer that they need is nitrogen. You don't need to give them anything else other than nitrogen. Well, you're thinking, what kind of fertilizer? Well, it could be organic, it could be synthetic. The tree does not know the difference between organic and synthetic forms of nitrogen, but the organic forms have the benefit of being time released because it requires the microbes in the soil to actually decompose them further and make the nitrogen available. But when you apply the fertilizer, this fellow on the lower right here, that's definitely, well, I'm not for certain, but it sure looks like a synthetic fertilizer to me. And so he's just following the package directions here. That's a lot of fertilizer in my mind for a tree this size. But I don't think it's as important that you know exactly the right quantity of fertilizer. It's just more important that you do it. And after you do it, don't overdo it, of course. But most fertilizer packages will have recommendations on them. And if I had this little tree, I think I'd put a half a cup and split and apply a half a cup of, say, 5-5-5 or 10-10-10. I know those are, one has twice as much nitrogen as the other, but I would just spread that around and water it in 3 times during the summer. What's been suggested to me in the past is, okay, well, it's hard to remember. Well, put some on Memorial Day, put some on the 4th of July, and put some on Labor Day. And there's your 3 fertilizations during the growing season. It's probably not the greatest idea to add fertilizer before the tree leaves out, if you're thinking about doing anything right now, because it really can't take up any water in significant amounts until it has those leaves, which then drive the transpiration process, the water relations process, and the fertilizer is moved upward in the tree with the irrigation water. If you find that you get a crop of fruit, I'll make a statement right now, maybe somebody will disagree with it or whatever, but I've been growing fruit here in Prescott for about 20 years. And in the last few years, it's gotten warmer. Yes, and climate change does have an impact, and we're seeing that worldwide. But the climate change in the Yavapai County, the upper elevations of Yavapai County has really made it the climate more desirable for growing fruit. If we could get reliable precipitation, that would help, but we're talking about irrigating these trees. But definitely it's the warming that we've had over the last, say, 10, 15 years, certainly lessens the probability that you're going to lose your crop due to a late spring frost. So if you get a crop and it's set fruit like crazy all over the tree, you're going to have to thin the fruit. And of course, you can decide, I'm not going to thin the fruit. I don't have time for that. Well, Mother Nature has a way of thinning the fruit then on its own, on her own. And it's called the June drop, and it may thin the fruit more than you want. So the most time-consuming thing on my calendar for if I get a fruit crop and what I need to do is the thinning. I probably spend about 4 or 5 hours on each tree thinning the fruit. And so this example down below, you want the fruit to be about 5 to 8 inches apart. But on apples, there are 5 blooms per cluster, and it doesn't really reflect that here. But the one in the center is called the king bloom, and the 4 on the outside are less desirable and will probably make a smaller apple. It'll still be a great apple, but if you are thinning by hand, look for that king bloom, and I would prune off this one and this one over here, leaving that central one to fruit. I would remove one in this cluster. I would remove one in this cluster. Looks like there's 4 here. I would thin that down to just 1. I would thin each of these clusters down to just 1. And lo and behold, that's what you see in the next picture. That's an artist's rendition, of course. The real world, it probably isn't as perfect as that. But what this does is it really sends the resources that the tree has. The leaf area on the tree is collecting sunlight and converting it into sugar. And if the fruit is distributed properly and there's the right amount of leaves around each fruiting area, then the fruit will get larger and sweeter. So that's the idea here. It improves the quality. Well, I don't know what happened there, but I don't think I was done, but let me go back and look just to make sure. There. I think that was the last slide. And I know we had a lot of comments, and yeah, it was. Pardon me for that. I'm going to stop sharing again. And Tricia, if you want to help me with the chat box, that's great. The other thing, before we do, let me do one. I'm going to check the time. Actually, we're probably tight on time. So let's go to the questions. And if we have more time, I've got a couple of things I can share.
Okay, first question was from Carlin. He says, I have a pretty old peach tree, but the fruit is not stone free, and the branches had to be cut way back due to disease and bad pruning by not too experienced gardeners. Is there a possibility of grafting a better stone free variety onto this established and pretty happy root system instead of replacing the whole tree? And can a larger trunk successfully be grafted to an established root system?
There's a lot of questions there.
Yes, there is.
My advice is when a peach tree gets 20 years old, that's an old peach tree. And I would just strongly encourage you, sentimentality aside, right? I would encourage you to get a new tree because there's many freestone varieties that are out there. And as you mentioned, yours is a cling style peach. So, here's what I would say is plant a new one. And no, you can't graft a big giant piece of wood onto another big giant piece of wood. You have to graft a small twig or bud onto the tree. And it's just not so easy to do when you get something like that. I imagine it has dead wood. I imagine it has sun scald on the south and west side or on the upper surfaces of the branches. So just don't be shy about replacing it. And if you don't like that answer, just limp along with what you've got and take what it gives you. But that tree is probably not salvageable to make anything other than what it is right now.
Well, Corey, back when you were talking about chilling requirements, asked if you could review again some fruit varieties that do not have chilling requirements high enough for your area. And are we looking for fruit trees that need less than 1,000 hours?
You will not, thank you, Tricia. You will not find trees with chilling requirements greater than 1,000 very commonly. That's kind of the upper limit. But in Phoenix, if they grew the varieties that we have now, they would never produce fruit because they would never become dormant over the year. And so they would not bloom correctly. So they grow an apple variety in the valley called Anna. It has 200 chill hours. You do not even want to think about growing that here because it'd probably bloom in December or some odd time. And within reason, you need to follow those chilling requirement numbers. And you can fudge a little bit, but you don't want to fudge too far away from that. And the other thing in the publication that's been listed, there's some varieties listed there. Those are good, solid varieties of different types of deciduous fruit. That's the UofA publication that we've linked. Other than that, it's a big topic, and quite honestly, measuring and determining chilling requirements is a bit of alchemy involved, and it's very mysterious. You'll notice that all the numbers are in increments of 50. So, that tells you right away it's a pretty inexact science. But really getting the varieties in the ground that you think are going to do well, and then moving forward from there is what I would recommend.
Well, I know you didn't want to talk about pests, but Lee wants to know, is there any way of controlling worms in apples?
Yeah, and it's an hour-long conversation. I would refer you to our Master Gardener desks to do that. But in short, what I'll tell you is that insect is called the codling moth, and it's what makes the black center of the apple. And if you can eliminate the first generation, you can probably help yourself out a lot because it will have multiple generations throughout the year. If you're going to use a commercial spray, you have to spray it every week. If you're going to use an organic spray, you have to spray it every 3 or 4 days. But there are other techniques that are a little bit more complicated that you could apply using pheromones and or other things. The Japanese just use these little netted bags that protect the fruit from it once it starts to form. So there's a lot of things, but there's a lot of trade-offs there. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
And, oh, by the way, before we leave that, if you live in Sedona or someplace like that where there's apple trees just everywhere, it's going to be a problem all the time. And even if you take care of your trees, the neighbor's trees are going to cause you problems too with codling moth. Thanks, Tricia.
Cheryl wants to know, how can I find out how to graft and get rootstocks for grafting? I'm especially interested in dwarf rootstocks for container growing citrus. Paragraph can be moved inside and out daily when necessary for temps on wheels. I'm also interested in deciduous fruit too.
Again, that's a huge question. And if you live in Yavapai County, what I would recommend is that you get a Meyer improved lemon, put it in a big pot and move it in and out. And if you want to graft yourself, move to Yuma or someplace where you can do it outdoors. Grafting big things in pots, you've got so many factors working against you that, we want you to be successful with gardening. If you're an advanced gardener, work with Yavapai College, the Chino Agribusiness Center or something like that to solve some of these issues. But you'll need a greenhouse, you'll need lots of resources. And true dwarfs in deciduous trees are not common, but I know they're up and coming, but I don't really recommend them. If you want more information about it, look at that Dave Wilson website and what they recommend. But there is a group that I'll mention now that does some grafting, and they've done a scion exchange the last couple of years, but they didn't do it this year, probably because of the situation that we're in with COVID. And so anyway, there's a family, and part of that family owns Stoic cider, and they make hard cider, artisanal hard cider. And then their sister Rafael is a pomegranate enthusiast, and they usually host something. They haven't done it this year. And it's not really in my wheelhouse to do that, but they're very good at it. So Kanan Routson, one of the principals in Stoic cider, knows a lot about grafting, and I would try and get with some of the people that do know about grafting. Some of them are on this call, and go from there. It's a very big question. So I tried to just give you enough to whet your appetite. Let's keep going, Tricia.
Jerry wants to know, and I get this one too, how long do you give a young tree you've planted before you give up on it?
I'd give it 5 years max.
Got it.
And if you planted that tree and it came out of a bag from a big box store, I wouldn't even wait that long. I just rip it out and purchase a better tree. And let's talk about those trees. There's lots of ways to purchase those. There's one nursery in the Prescott area that will order from a bare root nursery, but you can order those trees that I showed you were from another place called Stark Brothers, very big outfit, been doing it for almost 100 years, I think. That's not an endorsement. None of these companies that I mentioned are endorsements, but in the Yakima Valley, there's lots of small nurseries. I mean, you start digging around and you'll find sources of bare root trees that are off the beaten path.
Well, here's a good question for this area. Sandy says, our well is a little high in arsenic. Will this affect or flow through to the fruit?
No, it will not flow through to the fruit, but there are some guidelines on arsenic in well water. And for edible plants, it's usually about 100 parts per billion where the dividing line is. So that's 0.1 part per million. I know that's technical stuff, but on your water test sheet where your results are, it'll indicate this. So for gardens and vegetables, definitely that 100 parts per million is the cutoff point. And then for animals and things like that, it's usually 200. And when a plant takes up the arsenic, actually it converts it to an organic form. What we're more worried about is just the dust of arsenic collecting on the outside of the fruit. So you would wash it carefully and so on. And if this is the Sandy that I'm thinking of, I won't mention your name, but if we were, I know a Sandy that lives in an arsenic area. I would go by the 100 parts per million. Billion,
Okay.
excuse me, 100 parts per
Billion.
billion.
Cheryl asks, is there a particular recommended orientation of the graft union when planting, north, south, etc.?
Yeah,
And then she has a follow-up.
yeah, there is. You want the graft union facing north, and that's to keep the sun off of it. The hottest side of the tree is the south and the west side. So the place where the rootstock might still be exposed should be facing to the north. It's not, most people abide by this. It's not critically important. The more important thing is to just take care of the tree so its canopy is shading the whole trunk. But if you're seeing bark damage, you can get some tree paint. And I know many of you have seen trees, the trunks painted white, and it's to mitigate sun scald issues. And it's recommended, especially if you have a lot of exposed trunk. Just as a little note here, if you live in Sedona, you might try and grow a fruit tree that's low, but the number of deer that are there, you won't have an apple or even a leaf that you can touch above 8 or below 8 feet. So you'll be on a ladder there, unless you can keep the deer out. So those are some other considerations.
Cheryl has some very good questions. She also asks, do chill hours determine when a tree comes out of dormancy, or is it early, late, a different factor? In other words, are excess chill hours then listed as a minimum for a tree going to cause it to bloom too early? And does that mean we need to not get early varieties or low chill varieties?
The chill hours is when dormancy releases. When the fruit forms is the early, mid, and late. So it's a whole, those are two separate things. And so in my apples, the Fuji is a mid-season and the Granny Smith is a late one. And that's what I'm talking about. So the early, mid, and late refer to when the fruit comes off the tree.
Sophia asks, where can I find the chilling hours for my location?
You're not going to find it. As I mentioned, it's an inexact science. If you'd like to share your location, I can take a stab at it. But you noticed in my presentation, there were these broad ranges for these geographic locations. And it really, if you're growing a peach in Prescott, you need to get as close to 1,000 or 900 as possible. But with apples and pears, you can go between 600 and 800 and be fine. And if it's longer, you'll be fine. But I've never seen 1,000-hour apple in memory.
We're still going on with a few more. Are you doing a donut ring of water in basin, 2 berms to define and confine water to a ring, or filling the diameter of the tree with 1 berm at the tree line?
Great question. I would just do 1 berm at the tree line. It's really not that, what you would have 2 of them for is to eliminate the water right next to the trunk. But as dry as we are here most of the time, I've never had any problems with water being right against the trunk for irrigation, because if it soaks into the soil rapidly enough, it shouldn't be a problem. If you're in a heavy clay, you may want to keep water away from the trunk. More importantly, keep the mulch away from the trunk too.
Well, and this follows up, Cheryl's just been very prolific. When you say only soil when planting the tree, do you mean no corrections to the pH, sulfur, no compost, no things to help the structure?
That's what I mean.
Yep.
And, sulfur, it's a temporary treatment. So the tree has to know how to operate in the environment that you planted in for longer than 2 to 3 years. And organic amendments disappear even more quickly than that. So yes, I'm saying just use native soil and don't fertilize it the first year either. I didn't mention that during the presentation.
We have just a few more left, Jeff. Diane asks, what about planting in filtered septic drainage site areas for fruit trees?
Don't do it. What comes out of the leach field has some salinity in it. And these are woody plants. The roots could invade the leach field. And so it's just not desirable. The main thing you want to think about I'm assuming this is an alternative system, but even in a leach field, is try and stick with grassy types of things and fibrous root systems that won't end up growing in diameter and clogging up the drainage pipe that is perforated there, and then you'll get a septic system failure. You don't want that. So I don't recommend planting much of anything other than native grasses and perennials and things in a leach field.
This has been a wonderful presentation. We've had great folks actually in the chat box answering questions. There's been good chat going on. Jeff mentioned our support team in the background. I'd like to give a shout out to some master gardeners who have been instrumental today. A big thanks to Lauren Paz, Bill Maines, and Mary Barnes. I'm Tricia Michelson. I hadn't said that, but I've been sitting up front doing all the and they've been in the back going crazy, making all this come together. So thank you guys. Also, we have upcoming presentations. In just 2 weeks, we're going to be doing all about tomatoes. The master gardeners, with being cooped up, have wanted something to do, so we've been going tomato crazy. So Debbie Allen and I are going to share a lot of knowledge with everybody who wants to join us on All About Tomatoes. That will be March 30th at 6:30 p.m. And our April presentation, we don't have a date yet for it, but I'm really excited. Betty Lose, a longtime master gardener, is going to be sharing wildflowers, and very excited to have her join us. So thanks to everyone who was here today, and just keep checking in because we'll be having more presentations.
And Tricia, I saw the questions about the Meyer Lemon, and if we want to stop the recording, I could visit with that person a little bit longer.